Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Craig Johnson and I am the co-creator of the GiLE Foundation. If a couple of you are new to our initiative, our mission here is essentially to support young people's pursuit of a successful and meaningful life. And we achieve that by developing their competencies and through research and advocacy. And today we're actually going to have a discussion about one of our focus areas, which is character building. So I'm joined by two brilliant minds, and we're essentially going to have a chat about character. What are the so-called desirable character traits? And perhaps more importantly, how you can actually develop them so that you can live a life that is more successful and more meaningful. Our first guest is Dr. Tom Harrison. He's a reader and program director for the MA in Character Education. So that's at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And he's also the Director of Education at the GiLE Center for Character and Virtues. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
No, fantastic. Our other only guest is Zoltan Vardy. Many of you might already recognize his face. He is a business growth mentor and the creator of the Launch Code, which is his own unique business growth framework that essentially combines corporate planning methods with entrepreneurial execution. So Zoltan, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Fantastic. Now, of course, that bio really does not give justice to the extensive experience that both of these gentlemen have, but I will share the description to the full bio in the description of the posted video. So yes, to everyone in the audience, guys, you essentially know the drill, so please pop your questions in the chat. I'll try my best to integrate them into the conversation, or otherwise you can just sort of ping them directly to the guests in the Q&A section, and I'm sure they'll try to respond wherever they can. So basically what's going to happen now is that there will be a moderated discussion for roughly 25 minutes. This will be followed by a 10-minute or so presentation by Tom about character education and what that sort of looks like at a university level. And then we'll take some more questions at the end and then try to wrap up. So that's the framing, and that's what's going to happen in the next 40 minutes or so. But before we plunge into the meat of this moderated discussion, which is how you can actually develop these successful character traits, I think it makes sense just to sort of take a step back and clarify some of the terms and concepts that we can then build on in the discussion. So Tom, maybe we can begin with you. How would you characterize character, if I can put it that way, and how is it conducive to flourishing as an adult in society?
Thank you very much, Craig. And that is probably the key question that we spend a lot of our time at the University of Birmingham and the GiLE Centre for Character and Virtues working on. Because clearly character is everywhere. It's something that we're all hugely interested in. It's something that we spend quite a lot of time, whether it be in kind of newspapers, media, or just in discussion with our friends, commenting on about each other, but actually trying to get to the the source of what do we really mean, how do we define, how do we conceptualize character is being something that has been a great debate for thousands of years and continues incredibly today. And I'll give you our particular take on what we think character is, but there are other kind of understandings and ideas out there. So within my work and the work, as I said, at the University of Birmingham GiLE Centre, we go right back to 2,000 years ago to kind of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, and his idea of character. And his understanding of character was the qualities that make us human and that allow us to kind of flourish, as was the word you actually used earlier, Craig, flourish, which leads us on to what do we mean by flourish. Well, more simply, I think we can see flourishing on an individual level and we can see flourishing on a more societal level. So we do need to talk about character qualities that contribute to our own individual flourishing. These things might be things like determination, resilience, we hear a lot about that, grit, teamwork, leadership, the sorts of probably qualities and skills that Zoltan's maybe talking about, in particular linked to entrepreneurship and those sorts of areas. But we also need to think about societal flourishing and what sort of character qualities or virtues, as Aristotle would have called them, virtues, human virtues, do we think contribute to that? And these may be more of the moral, the civic, and also the intellectual virtues. They help us individually, but they're also the sorts of qualities like compassion, empathy, honesty, integrity, generosity, civic mindedness, etc., that contribute to us coming together and working together in a community and more broadly a society. So when we talk about character, we need to, because although the individual character qualities can contribute to societal flourishing, they don't necessarily do. We can be resilient, determined, teamwork, and actually only get ourselves ahead and not actually in support of everyone else. Criminals, etc., have resilience, grit, teamwork, leadership, etc. So it's about how that's applied in that sort of area. So we need to balance those against each other. And I'll in my later kind of talk, I'll talk about what I think are perhaps the most important virtues. But I think the key thing for character is what makes us us, and also which of those qualities contribute to ourselves, kind of by flourishing, I mean being, kind of living happily with mental and physical well-being, but also contributing more broadly to society as well, which would have been the Aristotelian concept. He saw character as what contributes more broadly to societal flourishing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate the framing of the history as well as the societal aspect. So less of the individual and lots of examples you gave that you never even hear of at a university level. I want to turn to you, Zoltan, and get your sense of a reading of character, right? So yes, there's character that can support sort of your entrepreneurial success and your career success. Your launch code, which is something we'll probably touch on later, essentially looks at the mindset of those two perspectives. Perhaps you can sort of make the connection with character and your launch code.
Well, I'd take a step back first. I'd say I think there needs to be a distinction between character traits and character as a some sort of higher purpose or higher moral code, right? I mean, we can have characteristics or character traits, whether in the context of an entrepreneurial setting, it's persistence or focus or desire or agility or all these kind of character traits, which are important. But I actually do think that the fundamental importance of character is a high moral code. So the concept of trustworthiness, of fairness, of citizenship, of empathy, all those things that I think make people, human and interaction relevant, are just as relevant in an entrepreneurial setting. I mean, I think the way that you treat your customers, how much do you focus on really solving a problem that really matters to them? How much do you deliver what you say you will deliver? That could be a sense of character that I think is relevant. How you treat your team members, your colleagues. Do you look at them as cogs in a machine, or are you looking at them as individuals who are contributing valuable knowledge and experience and time to serve your business's purpose? But I actually think the most important reflection of character in that greater moral code sense actually is reflected in something I call the greater purpose of an entrepreneur, or a greater purpose of a business. I actually believe that as much as the fundamental purpose of a business by its nature is to generate a profit, right? It's generate revenues and generate a profit. Its purpose from a visionary perspective, it's much greater than that. I think that the most successful entrepreneurs do what they do not because they want to become rich or famous. They do it because they actually want to make somebody's lives better, right? They want to add value to society. They want to add value to the world. And I actually was reminded recently of just an example of this for perhaps one of the most famous entrepreneurs in the world, Steve Jobs, who was interesting character, right? He wasn't known as a very nice guy. Generally, he was particularly very nice with his people and very friendly. However, he had an incredibly clear vision for the greater purpose of Apple, the company that he created. And just to give you a clarity of how much this was the case, I actually came across a video of him speaking sometime in 1980. Right, he was 25 years old, and Apple was about 4 years old as a company. It basically had one product. It was the Apple computer. So the concept of a personal computer was just developing in the world. And this video of him shows him speaking to some business community or some sort of business organization in Southern California. And in this short speech, he talks about how the biggest challenge for the computer industry at that time, very young industry, was actually breaking the barrier between the individual and the computer. And how, in fact, he thought that Apple was extremely well positioned to solve this problem because the fundamental, the core of the company was to create a personal connection between an individual and a computer, and to enable that relationship to solve fundamental daily tasks and make their lives better. And what's amazing is this guy was speaking in 1980. Okay, so there was no such thing as an iPhone. There was no such thing as an iPad. There's no such thing as an iPod. There's no thing as digital music. There's nothing related to personal computing. I mean, all of that stuff was a complete dream, right? And here was this guy at age 25 telling basically what was the vision, the greater purpose of the company that he eventually would build. And I think that's pretty amazing if you think about it. That he ultimately, of course, built perhaps one of the most valuable and one of the most valued companies in the world, but he really did it driven by this greater purpose, to do something of value and not just to make money.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are talking the same language, because I know from the Aristotle, even your framework, Tom, you talk about that civic role of having a greater purpose, which is the moral code that you just mentioned, Zoltan. But it is missing, right? Especially in the higher education system. If anything, it's maybe supposedly taught indirectly. But I know you're doing a lot of work in the UK, and it's actually part of the national conversation, character education. So then how do we connect the two? So we've sort of touched on character from different perspectives, and we've packaged it differently, but it is essentially the same language. But what does character education actually look like at a tertiary level?
Yeah, great. I'll just I'll get into that conversation, just following on from what Zoltan says, because I think this is kind of a fascinating discussion about character. Obviously has to come from within. I mean, it's inspired by, and this is partially answering your answer, it's caught in a way by osmosis, by the environments, the communities, the families, the businesses, etc., that we grow up in, the values that are prioritized in those areas in a family or school or whatever setting help to contribute to that. What I think is really interesting about the example that Zoltan gave is that clearly leaders absolutely help to define or shape the sorts of environment, whether that be the university leader, the school leader, etc. Parents help to kind of shape the sorts of values that are prioritized in that space. In the tech industry, I think is a great example you gave of Steve Jobs, but I think you'd also probably find a lot of the big kind of more recent tech leaders around kind of Google, Facebook, these sorts of people really set out initially to very much a lot of what they taught was very altruistic, in terms, Google's strapline was do no evil, and they talked in many ways that they wanted to kind of this be a social good and bring people together and network. But there's always a challenge in that sort of environment, balancing up what Zoltan said between kind of financial and kind of business imperatives. There may be not, and it's great to hear Zoltan hear that, but when trying to choose between those sorts of things sometimes does become a bit of a clash. And one of the reasons we prioritize character is because other checks or other kind of moral theories that might or might not kind of promote us kind of doing good in the world sometimes struggle in particularly in tech, but other environments. So rules and guidelines, those sorts of things, deontological strategies are sometimes problematic. It's very hard to regulate big tech. It's been quite hard to regulate big business. That's why kind of financial crash happened. A utilitarian, a consequence approach hasn't really helped always. So that's why kind of our personal ethics, our personal character and virtue is so important in these settings. But that's why the focus on character, I think, is so important in the world right now. In terms of what we do about it, I started to, or how you might go about cultivating it. Well, clearly you can't get children, university students in classes and say, right, today we're going to have a lesson on character, and they all come out beautifully full of honesty or integrity or, whatever quality that we happen to be focused on. You can't explicitly teach character education in that sense, but I think you can do character court by making more emphasis around the kind of the core values, as I've said, the kind of the language that you use in any sorts of setting, the how you kind of explain key concepts in any sorts of kind of area, so people, children or university students understand that this is what is prioritized and important and a key principle in the organization, in the university, in the school. But I think there are things you can do around character taught as well. So that's character court, but there are things you can do around character taught, and some of that is around kind of the use of different types of activities that we use with students around kind of the use of dilemmas, the use of narratives, the use of exemplars, careful mentoring, character coaching, use of reflective strategies. There's lots of different approaches. I'll mention a couple in my presentation as well. Lots of different strategies that you might use in more of a talk focus that won't teach people character, but will make it more cognitively aware of the importance of it and prepare them for situations that demand a character-based response.
Thanks for that comprehensive response, Tom. And I will have one quick follow-up, because as soon as we start talking about values, that's essentially usually attached to culture, right? So it always becomes a thing where are we indoctrinating university students when we're starting to talk about these are the values that you must have instilled in you by the time you graduate? How does that sort of work when can you detach values from culture and teach it in some sort of secular way?
You could certainly teach it in a secular way. I mean, if I've just been talking about kind of Aristotle, that's a broadly secular. It was inspired actually kind of some religious understandings of virtue. Some of the work around Aquinas and Catholic understanding of virtue is actually drawn from Aristotle as well, but Aristotle's kind of broadly secular. The bigger question is, how does that look today? I would make a difference between values and virtues. I think values sometimes a bit more kind of culturally relative in terms of, let's look at open-mindedness or tolerance. Sometimes that can be kind of more determined on culture, but quite often the virtues that I said, these harder kind of qualities of compassion, honesty, trust, etc., tend to be considered important by people of all faiths and also of non-faith as well. So now how they look, there may be some differentiation in how they play out in different contexts and cultures, and we need to be culturally responsive. And the final thing I'll say on this, because I don't want to take up too much time, is our approach to character education is definitely not top-down, moralizing, fixing the kids, telling them how to behave. Our approach is about providing structure, mentoring, scaffolding, but ultimately what we want is character sought. So I talked about character taught and caught. We want character sought, which is children, young people, students, employees, whatever, seeking out opportunities autonomously through their own critical reasoning, challenging power structures if need be, to show the right sort of, to show kind of a quality that enhances society.
Fantastic. Yes, Zoltan, I definitely want to bring you in here because it's a nice sort of segue as to how we can teach some of these character traits, right? So we've heard about how it could be caught, taught, or sought. So I imagine, and that's a lovely framing, by the way. So I imagine, Zoltan, as you are mentoring some of these young aspiring entrepreneurs, you are sort of portraying a way where it can be, you could sort of have a moral underpinning or behavior that can be caught. They can catch it from you in that sense, but you can also teach it actively in terms of some of the exercises and whatever engagements that you do have with them. Maybe you can start talking about some of the practical things that you typically do to sort of cultivate this character in your mentees.
Sure. So when I work with entrepreneurs as a mentor, I actually am creating an opportunity for them to understand a process that you can follow in order to be a successful entrepreneur and to actually accelerate your business growth and just to simply be more successful in absolute terms. And that process, that sort of step-by-step blueprint is what I've given sort of this name to, the launch code, which is effectively it's a business development framework or a system that gives entrepreneurs an opportunity to follow that path. And it's based on my observations, not just from my own personal experience as an entrepreneur and as a senior executive and somebody who's actually built a dozen or so businesses around the world in different contexts, but also my study of some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. And the principles that I have built into the launch code are based on, I think, the three qualities that I see common among all successful entrepreneurs. And the first one is focus. The second one is agility. And the third one is persistence. And I think those three qualities together are what are character traits, but also representation of character that are going to be important if you want to be a successful entrepreneur. So how do I transmit this message? Well, when I talk about a focus, what's focus is the ability to decide where you place your limited time, effort, and resources, right? So where is it that you actually, and when you're building a business, you're starting from scratch, right? So there's nothing. And so in that context, you can go in all sorts of directions. And perhaps that's the biggest challenge in building a business, right? There's so many decisions to make. There's so many directions you can take that it's confusing. And so that's why sometimes entrepreneurs turn to people like me to help them find that focus. And so one of the exercises that I'll do to help these entrepreneurs define what they want to achieve is something I call destination planning. And what that actually means is that I'll ask them to imagine themselves 2 years from today and identify, kind of create a snapshot of where they want to get to, and what that company will look like at that moment in time, right? So it's almost like a Polaroid picture. You take a picture at that moment, what would your company look like? And so we go through this exercise of, what product are you actually producing? What sales and marketing efforts have you made? How many clients do you have? How big is your company? What's your organization? Are you a one-man show, or are you building a 100-person company with offices in three countries around the world? Defining those elements. Have you brought in investment, or have you not? Have you achieved certain levels of profitability, or have you not? How have you served your greater purpose? The one I talked about before. I talk a lot about the greater purpose as an important part of the process. So how have you served it at that moment? Are you sticking with it? How do you feel at that moment? A lot of these processes are driven not by rational goals, but by emotional connections. Are you proud? Are you successful? So I have them actually define that destination, as I call it. And then that serves as their guide, their North Star. As you go through that extremely difficult road of building a business, that's always there in front of you. Actually, what I do is I ask them to take a Post-it note, right? I think most of us have these on our desks. And I tell them to somehow write something on that Post-it note that defines that destination. It could be a number, it could be a symbol, it could be a sign, whatever, and to put it somewhere where they see it every day. My little Post-it note is here on my screen in front of me. I see it every day. I see what I want to achieve for my business. And that's something that I encourage people to do as well, because that's a great way to just make your destination become your part of your day-to-day life. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is agility. So agility is really about the ability to adapt and make quick decisions during movement, right? So if you're physically agile, if you're, let's say, a basketball player, you're moving in the middle of the air and you're turning around. Mental agility is the ability to make decisions under pressure. And so we will work on those type of situations where they'll come across a situation, and I'll talk about how they can work through that process, identifying their options, looking at the best possible solution, talking about how then to execute based on that solution. And that process of kind of give and take and analysis is something that's very valuable, because again, it helps you become agile and make quick decisions. And then the third bit, which is the difficult thing to teach, because I think it's a lot of it's driven by your own personality, is persistence, right? So that ability to dig deep. And perhaps you could share that little chart that I sent you, Craig, because I think it's a perfect illustration, I think, of what persistence means in practice. It's something I came across, I think, somewhere on the internet, and it's called The Emotional Journey of Creating Anything Great. And if you go from left to right, when you start an idea or you start a business, you say, this is the best idea I've ever had. And you very, very, very quickly fall to, this sucks, I have no idea what I'm doing. And that's a perfectly natural progression. And it's that moment where you feel like this is really horrible and difficult. It's persistent that's going to get you across that bridge, right? That dark swamp of despair, which is then ultimately going to lead you to, hopefully, over time, to the top right corner, this is one of the most things I'm most proud of, right? And so that process of moving through that line that you see on the screen is an absolutely typical, natural experience that most entrepreneurs have. And the successful ones are the ones that are capable of crossing that bridge and getting to the other side. And actually, if you just see this, regularly, if you just look at some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, I've studied Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, multiple cases where, when he started Amazon back in 1994, he was faced with an interesting situation. At that time, he was a one-man show, right? It was basically a guy selling books online. And one of the biggest US book retailers, a company called Barnes & Noble, decided that they were going to get into that same business. And basically, they had incredible resources, incredible money, time, everything on their hands. And they decided they're going to do an online bookstore. And so that moment, everybody said, Amazon is dead. There's no way these guys that are 2 years old, I think it was 1996, they're going to be overcoming this huge corporate competition. And Jeff Bezos facing this said, well, okay, that's fine. They might be the biggest bookseller, but you know what? Amazon is not just about books. So he just all of a sudden said, I'm going to start selling music and I'm going to sell videos as well. And so he expanded his product line and then all of a sudden started becoming the go-to place for all sorts of media and entertainment content. Now, as we know, that history has shown us that, you know, you can buy baby carriages, food, and books now on Amazon, right? So you're literally buying everything in the world. But before he got to that position, he was selling books, right? And he expanded. And so that ability to overcome these very difficult obstacles is what's going to define a successful entrepreneur.
Fantastic. Thanks for that explanation, Zoltan. I would like to see if we can address one of these quotes, which is linked to one of your examples you used about Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And maybe perhaps, Tom, you could be an interesting one to give a take on this one. So how would you separate character from personality, considering that Steve Jobs was considered a visionary, but he was also not a really nice guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated question, and I'm going to try and answer it in about 1 minute, basically. But I think the easiest way to say this is personality is quite often the traits that we might consider to be born with. Most classically, they talk about the big 5 personality traits. You know, how open-minded. You know, there's different sorts of kind of character traits. My mind's just been slipped about what all the big 5 are, and I don't want you to test them on me right now. But there's sorts of things about, you know, whether we're more kind of open to things or kind of closed-minded around stuff. It's about how the sorts of qualities that we often describe people by in terms of their kind of agreeableness and those sorts of things. Whereas character qualities are qualities or virtues that tend to be learnt. As I say, not learnt through direct instruction, but we learn through the environment. That honesty is something that's prized by our parents when we're very young. We learn through the environment that we think that it's good to be generous or kind or compassionate or empathetic, etc. So, I mean, there's such a big debate on the kind of nature nurture debate around these sorts of things, and I haven't got time to get into complexity, but I find, or generally we perceive kind of character qualities as a subset to some extent of personality, but differentiated in terms of how the environment, kind of might shape those.
Yeah, but if I could just add one element, just because I happen to raise the issue of Steve Jobs. So, I've read a lot about him, and I've spoken to people actually who worked for him, and the people that worked for him loved him. They really loved him. He was a visionary. He suffered no fools, right? He was not the guy that you would sit there and BS with all sorts of stuff. But if you respected the fact that you got a very clear feedback, you got extremely clear direction, you had the opportunity to state your position and defend it, and if he believed it, then he was, if he accepted that, he respected you, he was very good. That's to say he wasn't particularly good with people he didn't respect, but the people he worked with really loved working for him. So, the question of personality is also a matter of opinion, I guess.
Okay. Fantastic. I'm just watching the clock here, and I suppose maybe we can put some of the other questions on hold that I was going to pose to you. And then maybe, Tom, you can sort of get ready to share your screen. But I will say to some of the latecomers, if you did join us sort of midway, I know people are in and out, but what we've covered so far is we've talked about character, and we sort of conceptualized what that was. We then spoke about character education, and then touched on how you can develop some of these character traits, be it in the education system or through sort of exercises, be it with persistence, agility. We've touched on some of these. So I think now we're going to try squeeze in the next 10 minutes. Tom is going to just share a quick presentation about character education. And then at the end, we'll have 3 to 5 minutes for some last minute questions, which you can pop in the chat in the meantime. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think the discussion's so good. I'll try and keep this to 5 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for conversation between Zoltan and I, and questions coming in. So I'll just keep to 5 because some of the questions we covered anyway. But I just, you asked me particularly to talk about what kind of character education in universities might look like, and we've developed something called a kind of character education in universities, a framework for flourishing, because as you alluded to, and I made this point at a big teaching and learning event at my own university today, where I was making this point that we spend so much of our time focusing on knowledge and skill development, but actually if you look at any survey, employers quite often put, they don't always call it character, but these sorts of kind of social emotional character qualities as one of the things that they're most interested in. Clearly they for specialist jobs, you know, they do need people with skills to be kind of doctors, nurses, teachers, etc. I'm not dismissing that, you know, kind of skills and knowledge in those areas are important, but it's how you apply those skills in, you know, in that context, in that environment, that is so important. And it's often your character qualities that make that happen. So we want kind of good doctors, as in kind of good doctors who know what to do, but good doctors who are very good in terms of their kind of bedside manner and the way that they actually you know, carry out their practice, likewise a lot of the other professions as well. So we think there has been, to some extent, an absence of a focus on character in university settings, and likewise in schools. You said that our government's actually placing a lot more focus on character education in the UK, because they've really noticed that, because the curriculum in some way has narrowed, and actually good education is really good character education as well, because that underpins all the things we want out of schools, like attainment, like good behaviour, etc., etc. So framework flourishing you can find on the Jubilee Centre website, gives an overview of that. I've said a lot of these things, but we talk about the cultivation of character integral to the purpose of the university. We think it's core to it. That good higher education is good character education. It equips, you know, that, you know, I don't think you can have good higher education without a focus on it, as I've already mentioned. And I talked about contributing to societal flourishing, and therefore it can't simply be the private concern of the student, because a lot of universities are set up as civic universities, universities that are designed, quite a lot of them take public funding, etc., who are designed to really help kind of contribute to societies more broadly. But again, some of this is just summary from what I've said. Students, as I say, should be free to critically decide how they pursue their character development. This shouldn't be a top-down indoctrinating type scenario. And the focus that you can see in that bullet point, I think, is really in the second bullet point, which is so important, is on the development of, again, an Aristotelian term, phronesis, but quite commonly translated these days as practical wisdom. And practical wisdom really is about the free, independent, autonomous decision about about which is the right quality to put in place at the right time. We talked about different situations and different settings, different contexts. We're constantly having to make decisions. It's not like that. Quite often these qualities clash with each other. You know, should we be honest with someone, or should we be loyal to our friend, etc.? And it's about deciding, you know, which is the right quality to put in place. So that focus on phronesis or practical wisdom, that's applied character, knowing what's the right thing to do at the right place. And when you're younger, you're probably more likely to be kind of told how to behave, or more instructed in these areas. As you get to kind of secondary school and university level, that's about cultivation of wisdom. It's not about, you know, boundaries. It's about, you know, hopefully, you know, learning through experience, through getting things right, getting things wrong, good mentoring, reflection, etc., to develop that. And universities can place focus on that. I talked about being culturally responsive earlier, you know, not possession of a single philosophical transition, but emphasized across different cultures. And the hope is that university culture really prioritizes this, that, you know, when you go to a university, you understand that the university is about, you know, teaching you these skills and knowledge, but is also about cultivation of qualities that's going to help you individually, but also it's society-wide. And I'll just finish by saying here's an example of 7 practices that have been, some of them being tested more than others, that have come out in a recent paper by Michael Lamb and others, but they've been testing these in a number of different settings, including at Oxford University, where they have quite a well-known character leadership program there. And these are the sorts of strategies that they look at. So that first one, as I said, is about experiential learning. This isn't about learning character theoretically. It's about actually getting out and doing and learning about ourselves in those sorts of environments, but coupled with reflection. So it's the idea of kind of service learning, same sort of approach. You don't just go out and kind of serve, you actually learn through that service by kind of educational structures around you, helping you to reflect on them. Engagement with kind of exemplars, and these aren't just exemplars who are the great and the good, the Gandhis, the Nelson Mandelas of the world. That's great, but actually they're exemplars around us. They're often the most powerful ones, our peers, our friends, other people. Dialogue, which increases what we call virtue literacy. That's the knowledge and understanding of the importance of kind of character in your daily lives and how it actually looks and how you might apply it. Conversation about these sorts of variables. We've talked about Steve Jobs a little bit. He faced all sorts of situational variables. He would have been talking to different people at different times, for different purposes and reasons. And and it's about knowing how to apply the right sorts of quality in those situations. Coming back to kind of the practical wisdom idea, they've looked at moral reminders that making norms salient. There's some interesting work going on around the idea of nudge theory to try and not actually kind of tell us what to do, but kind of remind us in our daily lives about these sorts of things. The jury's a bit out on how that's actually working. And finally, kind of friendship is a very big kind of theme. Essentially, character is relational. It's about how we behave alongside other people, and friendship in its broadest sense and kind of a shared responsibility, shared accountability is really what binds people together and emphasizes character at the heart of them. So those sorts of strategies and practices, the more that they can be inculcated into a university or higher education setting, we think the more likely that students will develop the sorts of qualities that we think are desirable. But I'll stop there, and I don't know whether I got that into 5 minutes, but hopefully I've got it into a reasonably short amount of time.
There's certainly a blitz presentation, and thanks for that. I actually read that framework, and I really appreciated the document. What I will do is I'll share it with everybody for those who are interested in reading it as well. We've got a couple of minutes left. I will ask anyone in the audience to please pop your questions either in the chat or directly to us in the Q&A. I think in the meantime, while we're waiting, I can just pose another question to you, Zoltan, which is, bearing in mind your international exposure from your background in corporate and entrepreneurship, surely you've come across mentees from all around the world. And I'm also just curious how you've experienced that relationship between character and culture during your travels.
So I think just a bit of context for everybody. So I'm American, born and raised in the United States, but I've lived and worked in Europe for the last 30 years or so. And in my most recent corporate job, which was about 4 years ago, I was responsible for sales in over 30 countries around the world. So from Australia to Mexico and all points between. So I had a good insight into different cultures, different businesses, different business cultures and environments. And I can say with some certainty that I think the standard for character, as that moral code, trustworthiness, emphasis, or empathy, fairness, I think that's pretty universal, right? I think there's a general understanding that you be nice to people, you do what you say you're going to do, don't lie, don't cheat. I think those are pretty universal human traits or character traits that you do generally accepted. So I think that being said, there is a context in which I found it interesting that sometimes the way that these characters are interpreted differs from culture to culture. And actually, I can give you an example very specifically from my own career, which I found to be quite interesting. And this is not to do with my current role as a mentor to entrepreneurs, but in my former corporate role, I was actually CEO for the largest broadcasting group here in Hungary, TV2, for those of you who are in Hungary. So I was the CEO there until about 2010. And it's interesting that when you get into a very senior position at a Hungarian company, there is this sort of general understanding that you get to do a lot of things that might not necessarily be considered, high integrity, but they just come with the job, right? And the reason is because I'm in a position to make decisions about, sometimes millions and millions of dollars of business that would be bought by the company. And, these could be production companies, advertising agencies, all sorts of different service providers. And so I found myself in a unique situation where oftentimes when we'd be, putting out a tender for a particular service, people would contact me, through various sources and make all sorts of offers about, my personal financial gain if I were to select them as a service provider over somebody else. And for most, I would say Hungarians, born and bred here, that was one of the benefits of the job. That was the perception. For me, growing up in the United States, and with parents who I obviously love and respect, and who taught me that that's not the right thing to do, I rejected these outright, and I said, look, I'm a very well-paid senior executive. I'm certainly fine with that, and may the best man win. And it was interesting to see the reaction from different people, right? So generally speaking, there was a sense of, I can't believe this guy's not taking advantage of his position. He's crazy. It was almost like it was weird that I was sort of rejecting this type of business practice. But interestingly, after time, because it's a small market in a small world, my reputation spread and people understood that I wasn't in for this game. And all of a sudden, that sort of wonderment turned into respect. And it was a very interesting feeling. And obviously hear back things from there. And there's like, Vardy, he's a straightforward guy. He's not somebody that can be bought, so to speak. And so I'm actually very proud of that as a part of my character. Now, could I maybe have been better off financially if I had taken those doors? Yes, but I can also look in the mirror and say that I did the best job that I can. And for me, that character has a million times greater value than, let's say, the financial benefits of not behaving with integrity. So that's sort of my view of this cultural difference.
Fantastic, and I really appreciate that comprehensive answer, because it is about cultivating people who are better for society. And I want to also just turn back to you, Tom. There's a question posed here by Grace. Isn't morality relative, right? And if so, how do you incorporate that in a campus scenario where everyone has different backgrounds? Do you want us to sort of answer that and sort of link it in a way to what Zoltan also just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. Grace is full of difficult and challenging questions today. Thank you very much indeed, Grace. And yeah, I mean, I loved Zoltan's example there, because that is exactly what I mean about having to make decisions in real life situations which are context specific, and having to use your wisdom to decide what is best to do in that particular area. And there would have been many people who would have taken the money, I'm sure, and maybe lived to regret it, because quite often character is one of the first things that people describe you by. You can make and kind of lose on how people describe you in these sorts of settings. There is a more general kind of worry that there may be kind of a lessening of that across the board. But as Zoltan was saying, you'll find that kind of almost across the world, you'll find character is prioritized, whether it be in small group family discussions or whether it be kind of by national government. So I think we've all got an interesting state. But coming back to Grace's important question about the relative value of character, well, I'm trying to make this distinguish as I say, I think it's culturally responsive. We wouldn't be saying that you should be, for example, doing kind of Aristotelian character education, or character education that comes from a Buddhist tradition, or comes from a kind of Hindu tradition, or a Christian tradition, or a Muslim tradition. All of these traditions have character almost at the heart of their very philosophies, and it would be up to kind of individuals, what in many ways kind of the sorts of traditional or reasons that they want to follow in that place. But what you can find within a lot of those traditions is that it's a general understanding that these core qualities that I keep talking about, honesty, compassion, courage, justice, etc., are written within the kind of the works, great works from related to those religions. But also, as I've been saying, those who have not of faith also, because surveys show this, tend to, around the world, tend to show that we prioritize those qualities because we understand that they help to kind of unite us and bind us together. But where is the relativeness to some extent? And I think this follows on from what Zoltan was saying, was how that looks like in actual individual situations, and how individuals interpret them in those sorts of areas. And our interpretation of character is that that is shaped over time, by the population, by a group practical wisdom, so to speak, in terms of what we think is relatively right within those different kind of contexts and settings. So it's happening on a kind of a thick level, I suppose, and kind of a thinner level as well, in terms of how culture shapes how we respond in any one time, and it's constantly changing, it's constantly moving. So it is relative, but there is structures around that relativity.
Right, fantastic. I think that was the last word there. I'll take another 30 seconds or so just to wrap up the webinar. But I will say, firstly, thank you to Tom and Zoltan for joining us today. we've essentially tried to, in a nutshell, a very short time, to cover what is character, what that looks like, beyond just knowing that it's about who you are. Character really can be caught, taught, and sought. And I appreciated the presence of these two gentlemen because we essentially wanted to look at it from a human flourishing perspective, but also look at it from entrepreneurial success, corporate success, and how these two are actually more or less the same, and how you can be a better person if you just make the effort to actively work on yourself.